Dave Allen will be moved to share more of his favourite sketches with us in half an hour, and that's here on BBC One.
The 9 o'clock news from the BBC with Julia Somerville and Andrew Harvey.
President Reagan says he wants a special investigator to look at the Iranian arms deal.
The MI5 affair, Mrs. Thatcher turns the attack on Mr. Kinnock.
In Dublin, the government fails to stop another set of security service memoirs.
Borders century saves Australia's face.
And tonight's picture sale that's set to rewrite the record books. Good evening. President Reagan says he'd welcome the appointment of an independent investigator to look into the whole arms to Iran cash to Contras affair. Mr. Reagan went on national television this evening and promised that whatever the investigation turned up would be made public. He also named the man he's chosen to replace Admiral Poindexter, his national security advisor who resigned when the Contra cash scandal came to light. He's Frank Carlucci, a former CIA man and ambassador. But that announcement has been overshadowed by the possibility of a Watergate-style investigation. It's now up to 3 judges to decide if there's to be one and who's to head it.
Congressional leaders applied some extra pressure this morning, arriving at the White House to demand action from the president. By midday, he was on national television, calling for the appointment of a special prosecutor, Watergate-style, and explaining why.
This morning, Attorney General Meese advised me of his decision that his investigation has turned up reasonable grounds to believe that further investigation by an independent counsel would be appropriate. Accordingly, consistent with his responsibilities under the Independent Counsel Act, I immediately urged him to apply to the court here in Washington for the appointment of an independent counsel.
It was the promise of full disclosure demanded by Congress, with the national security apparatus laid bare.
With the appointment of an independent counsel, we will have in place a dual system for assuring a thorough review of all aspects of this matter. If illegal acts were undertaken, those who did so will be brought to justice. If actions in implementing my policy were taken without my authorization, knowledge, or concurrence, this will be exposed and appropriate corrective steps will be implemented. I recognize fully the interest of Congress in this matter and the fact that in performing its important oversight and legislative role, Congress will want to inquire into what occurred. We will cooperate fully with these inquiries.
Mr. Reagan said he'd taken the unprecedented step of allowing 2 former national security advisors to testify before Congress. He was also announcing the appointment of a 3rd, Frank Carlucci, a former deputy director of the CIA and the Defense Department, a man acceptable to Democrats and Republicans alike. He'll be taking over an organization under strict scrutiny. The Attorney General was asked to reflect on how the new moves would affect Mr. Reagan's popularity.
There has been a great deal of confusion. As the President said, many of these things are difficult to comprehend. And I think that when all of the facts are out, when the various inquiries and investigations and reviews are completed, I think that it will be shown that this President acted promptly, acted properly, and that as a result, his credibility will not only return to where it was, but I would suspect would be enhanced.
There was immediate reaction from congressional leaders.
I feel good about what the President told me flat out, about the honesty and truthfulness with which he told us the events as he knows them.
I think we all believe the President, obviously, and we want to get this behind us.
But they're a long way from that. On Capitol Hill, senior members of Mr. Reagan's own party are still demanding resignations and naming names. Should the President tell his Chief of Staff, Donald Reagan, to go?
Yes, I think he ought to.
Should he ask for Bill Casey's resignation?
Yes, I think he should.
What about George Shultz?
That, I think, is arguable. It's not clear in my mind precisely what the Secretary knew, and furthermore, the continuity of foreign policy might dictate the President would keep Shultz on.
The man already fired is Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Last night he claimed his constitutional right not to incriminate himself and declined to give evidence at a closed hearing.
I'm grateful that I'm still a serving officer and continue to serve President Reagan as my commander-in-chief.
Mr. Reagan will be grateful at least for that support, for he still faces powerful criticism. The latest national opinion polls show his approval rating has dropped a staggering 21 points over the last 2 weeks. Today, he acted to reverse that trend. There's a widespread belief that he'll have to act again. This is Tim Sebastian for the 9 o'clock news in Washington.
The government's efforts to block books by former MI5 officials have received setbacks in 2 separate court hearings in Sydney and in Dublin. And they've once again been the subject of exchanges in the House of Commons. Mrs. Thatcher made a veiled threat to stop giving confidential information to the Labour leader Neil Kinnock in his capacity as a Privy Councillor. Mr. Kinnock is currently visiting the United States. In his absence, the Prime Minister attacked what she said was his abandonment of cross-party agreements on security and defence.
Confidential briefings on a Privy Councillor basis between the Prime Minister and opposition leaders are not everyday events. But the fact that Mrs. Thatcher is threatening to discontinue them is the clearest sign of the breakdown in relations on security between her and Mr. Kinnock. The reason is Mr. Kinnock's contacts with Peter Wright's lawyers in Australia. In the Commons, Mrs. Thatcher wholeheartedly agreed with a senior Tory backbencher who urged her not to have any more truck with Mr. Kinnock on security issues. And she attacked Mr. Kinnock on this and defence.
Mr. Speaker, the abandonment of the bipartisan approach to security matters is totally and utterly fundamental to the security of this country. The Leader of the Opposition has abandoned a fundamental defence policy pursued by his predecessors. He's now abandoned a fundamental security policy pursued by the Prime Minister.
Tonight, Roy Hattersley, Labour's deputy leader, challenged Mrs. Thatcher. If she was proposing to abandon the practice on confidential briefings continued by every government since the war, she should say so and justify her decision. Otherwise, it was indefensible to encourage the rumour. On the wider issue of the government's attempt to stop publication of Mr. Wright's book, Mr. Hattersley claimed in the Commons that Mrs. Thatcher was treating the law as if it was her own property. But once again, she refused to comment on security issues.
The government is considering an appeal against today's decision by a court in Australia that it must hand over secret documents to the lawyers of Peter Wright. The judge didn't say which documents are covered by his order, but most are believed to concern the government's decision not to try to stop publication of other books containing information leaked by MI5 officers.
Within 1 hour of the ruling against the Crown, the judge's list of secret documents to be released was ciphered to Downing Street from the 10th floor Sydney office of the British Consulate. This is the defence's original shopping list. The judge has shortened it, but the defence appears to get most of what it wants. The judge's ruling is a major reverse for the Crown. In effect, Mr. Justice Powell rejected the Crown contention that Britain's national interest coincides with Australia's in this case. Today's judgment looks ominous for the British government in terms of the overall trial. An affidavit from Downing Street claiming the documents were super sensitive cut no ice with the judge. Today, an American lawyer testified for the defense that the CIA is happy to release agents' memoirs so long as they're vetted.
It's all very clear that we don't endanger the lives of people undercover, we don't endanger ongoing operations. But beyond that, the practice ought to be, and the practice is pretty much in the United States, that people can talk about everything, particularly stuff in the past.
What's your judgment about whether the CIA would allow Peter Wright's book to be published?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about it. For one thing, most of the material is fairly old, and there's no question of an ongoing operation or currently undercover personnel. And it would add to the debate. In the United States, they would look absolutely ridiculous trying to stop the book.
The defense is holding back its star witness, Peter Wright, from testifying until it gets the secret documents edited by the judge.
See a mistake, huh?
This is Brian Barron for the 9 o'clock news in Sydney.
The second setback for the government came in Dublin, where the High Court rejected its attempt to ban another book. this one by a woman who worked for MI5 during the Second World War. Britain's Attorney General had argued that all former MI5 officers had a duty to remain silent about their work. But the judge ruled that such a duty didn't extend to a book published in a foreign country. She said the publishers of Joan Miller's book, One Girl's War, had a constitutional right to distribute it.
The Dublin High Court took just 15 minutes to reject the Attorney General's attempt to have the book banned. His Irish lawyer argued that Joan Miller's memoirs broke the principle of lifelong confidentiality by Secret Service agents. Miss Justice Mella Carroll said she'd read the book overnight. Under the Irish Constitution, there was a right to publish. The plaintiff had to prove that that constitutional right should not be exercised. The public interest of a foreign government was outside the scope of the Irish court. The judge said no breach of confidence in a private or commercial setting had been proved. What was at stake, she added, was the very important constitutional right to communicate information freely.
I'm very pleased that the High Court in Dublin has not allowed itself to be used for a British policy of suppression. And I look forward to selling a lot more copies of the book.
The decision here in Dublin will produce still more deep embarrassment for the British government and MI5, because this decision presents a loophole in Ireland for other former agents and authors who want to reveal some of the inner machinations of Britain's Secret Service. In Dublin this afternoon, One Girl's War was back on sale and selling fast. Its courtroom notoriety has guaranteed a sellout, some for secret export to the United Kingdom, even if the bookseller's price has risen £1 since the case began.
Geoffrey Collier, the former city executive who resigned last month from a leading merchant bank, was today formally accused of share-dealing offences. Mr. Collier was served with a summons connected with dealings in the shares of the AE Engineering Group, which was the subject of a takeover bid earlier this year. At Westminster, MPs have been debating insider trading, that is, using confidential information to make money on the stock market. The debate followed yesterday's announcement of an inquiry into the Guinness Company. It's thought one area of investigation will be the activities of the American financier Ivan Boesky. He's already been fined $100 million for insider dealing in American shares. Today, the Labour MP Robin Cook linked Mr. Boesky's activities with the recent takeover by Guinness of the Distillers Group.
He was particularly active in the Guinness bid for distillers. He built up a very large holding in distillers, which is rumoured to have reached the figure of $100 million, a figure which he assembled well in advance of the announcement of the bid.
I'm surprised that the honourable gentleman, the member for Livingston, expects me to add anything to what was said in yesterday's statement about the investigation into Guinness. Of course, I can't add anything to what was said in that statement. It would be quite wrong and improper for me to do so.
Ivan Boesky was a Wall Street legend. At 49, he'd made a huge personal fortune. He said he believed greed was healthy. His book, Merger Mania, gave the official version of how he used his skill as an arbitrageur, buying shares in companies about to be taken over. His publishers have now dropped the book, since he admitted much of his success came from inside information. His poker game was conducted with marked cards. Ivan Boesky ran an office with 300 phone lines and got up every morning at 4:30. But since he was caught and fined $100 million, he's been naming names to the authorities. Now in New York, it's being said that a few arbitrageurs are tipped off by some companies before they make a hostile takeover bid. The ARBs, as they're known, buy up vast numbers of shares in the target company, ready to sell out to the bidder at a higher price. They make a profit, and it can help the bid to succeed. But in the Boesky case, the American authorities spotted share prices rising before bids and caught him insider dealing. Their Securities and Exchange Commission has tough legal powers. But in Britain, today's debate stemmed from opposition criticism that here the powers don't go far enough. The Big Bang has brought together different firms with potential conflicts of interest under one roof. The new investment banks include stockbroking sections, dealing on the constant ups and downs in the market, separated by security barriers known as Chinese walls from the merchant bank section of the same company, which will have privileged information on takeovers and so on, which the stockbroking side mustn't hear about. To regulate all that, each of these investment banking companies has to have its own internal watchdog team looking for leaks through the wall. Over them, each financial market, such as the stock exchange, has its own body setting the rules for that sector of the city. And keeping an eye on them, the Securities and Investment Board will be the top watchdog from next year.
The world is changing for the small investor and for the big professionals. And you have to adapt your regulation systems to the new world. And I hope that London will be, in the future, one of the best, if not the best, regulated markets in the financial world.
But unlike its American opposite number, the Securities and Investment Board won't be concerned with insider dealing. That will remain a matter for the Department of Trade and Industry, and they've been relying heavily on the American authorities for their information on Mr. Boski's British dealings.
James Long reporting. The Rover Group is considering a possible tie-up between its Leyland Truck subsidiary and one of two foreign companies, DAF of Holland and the American-owned truck producers Foden. The Trade and Industry Secretary, Paul Channon, told the Commons that the object of the new talks was to achieve a secure future for the truck company. But Labour MPs said any collaboration was bound to lead to job losses.
In South Africa, a black doctor and his wife have been shot dead. They were both active in the anti-apartheid movement. Dr. Fabian Ribeiro and his wife Florence were shot outside their home in Mamelodi Township near Pretoria. It isn't clear who was responsible, but neighbours say they think the couple were killed because Dr. Ribeiro treated victims of the unrest.
Dr. Ribeiro and his wife were shot by 3 unknown gunmen at the back door of their surgery last night. He was a prominent anti-apartheid activist, often detained himself by the authorities, often under attack. Last March, a petrol bomb destroyed the upper story of his home. He continued with his work, chronicling the injuries of those who'd been arrested and detained. Mamelodi clergyman Nico Smith thinks that's why he died.
I know that he was treating people who were harassed by the police, especially young people, and he took photographs of the injured people to show what sort of injuries they had.
Christmas is heightening emotion here over the continued detention of hundreds of children. Catholic churches at the weekend held services to pray for those children and their parents. Relatives of the detainees came forward to offer their personal prayers. Parents queue every day at the offices of the Detainees Support Committee. The committee says up to 1,800 children are still in jail. They also claim there's medical evidence indicating 8 out of 10 detainees have been ill-treated. The authorities maintain that it's children that provoke much of the political violence in the townships, that gathered in mobs, they intimidate the adults. Gilly Niatella is 13, already a political activist. He was detained and put in jail for 10 weeks. He claims he was often beaten and that electrodes were attached to his finger and to his groin. Gilly Niatella was eventually released, but children as young as 11 are still in jail. Anthea Houston is 16 and was detained when she was caught handing out protest pamphlets.
People were taken away and they were interrogated. We knew that if they didn't come back, that they had been physically abused or they had been beaten up, and those people would be sent to hospital, or the doctor would. They'd be kept separate from us until such time when their wounds would heal, and then they'd get sent back.
Today in Johannesburg, the women's movement Black Sash launched a campaign to have the children freed by Christmas.
I'm ashamed of a government which not only takes children into detention, but also refuses any public information about them.
Names of detainees must be tabled in Parliament, but Parliament hasn't sat since mid-September. Neither the government's Bureau of Information nor the police would comment today on detentions in general or individual cases. This is Michael Burke for the 9 o'clock news in South Africa.
In southern France, gunmen seized 3 hostages and threatened to kill them after a raid on a bank. They grabbed 2 men and a woman at the bank in Perpignan to cover them as they escaped. They held guns to the hostages' necks, then led them onto a van. The police kept close but were warned off by shots from the raiders as they headed for the airport. A siege of several hours followed as marksmen covered the airport buildings and the robbers asked for a ransom of £90,000 and a plane out of the country. Then, later tonight, French marksmen shot out the tires of the robbers' van. Within minutes, the hostages were released unharmed, and soon afterwards the gunman surrendered.
In India, thousands of demonstrators have defied a ban on public gatherings to protest at the slaughter of Hindus by Sikh extremists. Cars were overturned and set alight by protesters in the capital, New Delhi. Armed police were sent in to deal with the unrest, which has been mounting since Sunday, when 24 Hindus were shot dead by Sikh gunmen in the Punjab. Yesterday, Sikhs killed another 10 Hindus. Today's strikes and protests brought much of the northwest, including the Punjab and Delhi, to a standstill. The violence is the latest in a long campaign by extremists to set up the Sikh state in northern India. Cricket, and in the second test in Perth, England have built up a lead of 390, leaving just one day to bowl out the Australians. England, in their second innings, are 199 for 8. They dismissed Australia in their first innings for 401.
Australia's ambition this morning modest enough to save the follow-on. It looked beyond them when Dilly trapped Zura LBW.
Going down left side. No, it's not.
Alan Border was still there, expertly crafting his 20th Test century.
He's got it. That one played away behind square on the offside. That's Alan Border's 20th Test century.
Fittingly, Border saved the follow-on, Australia's sweetest moment of the series so far.
It's a bad ball from John Embry, and Border might have done it.
After lunch, Border finally went for 125, thanks to a juggling catch by Richards. Australia all out for 401.
Oh, and he's dropped him. No, he's got it.
The lanky Reed is literally head and shoulders above the other bowlers, and Julie had Athy caught by Border for 6.
Oh, and he's got him. He's out. Caught it slip.
Lamb had also gone when Gower made the runs simply flow.
That's well played. Lovely shot by Gower. Right through the gap on the offside.
For the second time in this match, Botham proved fallible with the bat, caught by Greg Matthews for 6.
That's in the air, and he's out. So
Mike Gatting remained a solid presence, deciding to bat on rather than declare, to be absolutely sure of not losing this match. He'd scored 70 when he tried to force the pace too hard. A betting man would almost certainly have his money on a draw. This is Michael Peschart for the 9 o'clock news in Perth.
And there'll be live coverage of the final 2 sessions of play in the Test on BBC2 tomorrow morning at 5:35 a.m.
Paintings worth millions of pounds are being sold at Sotheby's tonight. The sale has already grossed over 20 million, with one painting alone fetching more than 6 million pounds. Experts are predicting a new world record for a single sale. In 1984, Christie's set the record when the Chatsworth drawings went for more than 21 million pounds. Last month in New York, Sotheby's pushed the record beyond 29 million pounds. And tonight they're confident of raising it to 30 million.
Some 800 of them, in love with paintings or just their investment value, packed into Sotheby's to buy someone else's impression. They came from the United States, from Japan.